This past week, you read about Abraham and his journey. Abraham, of course, was, according to the Bible, born in the city of Ur. And so one of the assignments that I gave you last week was to look up some of the artifacts that were found when they were excavating the city of Ur. Excavations of Ur took place between 1922 and 1934, and they were funded by the British Museum and the University of Pennsylvania. They were excavated by the archaeologist Sir Charles Leonard Woolley, and a total of about 1,800 burials were uncovered, including 16 that he described as royal tombs. And the royal tombs contained many valuable artifacts. Here we see what the ruins of Ur look like today. So one of the artifacts that you could have chosen to look up was this very famous carving of a lion. Here we see a picture of what Woolley called the royal game of Ur. It was found in one of the tombs that he designated as being a royal tomb. And historians still have not quite figured out what the rules of the game might have been. Some jewelry that was found in one of the royal tombs, and a very famous headdress. Notice also that there are beautiful earrings displayed there, a musical instrument, and some golden vessels. And I thought this artifact was very interesting. It depicts a ram stuck in what looks like a thicket. And it sort of reminded me of the story of Abraham. I'm sure that the artist was not trying to depict the story of Abraham, but that's what it reminded me of. When Woolley was excavating the tombs, he was fortunate enough to come across an unlooted tomb, which is very, very unusual. It was the tomb of a queen, and according to the cylinder seal that they found, her name was Puabi. One of the interesting things that they discovered was that in addition to Puabi being buried in that tomb, that there were several of her servants, probably servants, buried with her, probably in the form of human sacrifice. This next week, we're going to be moving on to Abraham's son Isaac in our reading, as well as reading about King Hammurabi. The last strong leader of Mesopotamia had reigned a little over 400 years before Hammurabi. Remember Naram's sin of the unified Akkad. After the fall of Sargon's united Mesopotamia, the area once again was divided among several kings who ruled individual city-states. Just a reminder of the extent of Sargon's kingdom. And when it fell, here we see the different city-states that it divided into. You see Larsa and Lagash. There's the city-state of Umma and Kish. And of course, down there on the edge of the Persian Gulf, there is the city of Ur. We're going to go ahead and fill in the blanks in the little section marked the city-state structure of government. Although all the cities shared the same culture in the area, each city had its own king, its own warriors, its own patron god, and functioned like an independent country. City-states included the city and the surrounding farmland. Examples include the Sumerian cities of Ur, Uruk, Kish, and Lagash. And here we see an artist's reconstruction based on the archaeological evidence of what the city of Uruk may have looked like during this time period. At the center of each city was the walled temple with a ziggurat, that is a massive tiered pyramid-shaped structure. And notice that at the top of the ziggurat stood the temple. Powerful priests held much political power in the beginning of these city-states. We're going to pause just for a moment to mention that the city of Uruk's main god was the god Anu, and the temple at the top, archaeologists have named the White Temple. They believe that it was whitewashed on the inside and the outside to better reflect the sunlight shining on it, since Anu was the god of the sun, as well as the god of the air. Here we see what an artist believes that the inside of that temple would have looked like. I think that they have left out the god Anu, so we're going to go ahead and set him up in the temple, along with some food offerings and the ubiquitous votive figures that would have stood in front of him. So that gives you an idea of what the inside of the temple at the top of the ziggurat would have looked like. Notice that the main temple area was rectangular. It let in the natural sunlight. Notice also that there are some doors at the sides because there would have been other rooms off the main temple area. Now, to finish up our fill in the blanks, military commanders eventually became rulers and kings of these city-states. The ideal king served two important roles. First, he would have filled the role of a triumphant warrior. This was extremely important because the city-states were always arguing with one another. And second important role was that of intercessor with the gods. Also very important. Recall when we talked about Mesopotamian religion that a lot of the gods were looking for ways to punish bad behavior, and so it was important to have your king in a good and a right relationship with the gods so that they could intercede for the city and for the people of the city. So the idealized version of that was what they called the shepherd king. The shepherd king was a king who was able to bring these two important roles together. He was a triumphant warrior, and he was an excellent intercessor with the gods. So, if you will turn to your worksheet labeled Shepherd Kings of Mesopotamia, we're going to look at several depictions of kings from these different city-states and decide whether they wanted to be remembered more as a warrior or more as an intercessor. And each of these kings had different priorities. So we're going to start with Lugal-Zagizi. And you can see him there dressed in a ceremonial robe. He's wearing a ceremonial headdress that often in Mesopotamian art, that headdress is one that is worn by a god or a goddess. And so I'm going to go with he wanted to be more remembered as an intercessor rather than as a warrior. Turning to Sargon of Akkad, notice that he is depicted as sitting on a war horse and he has his bow and arrow ready to go, and so Sargon wanted to be remembered as a warrior. Moving down the page to Naram-Sin, we see that he is depicted here along with members of his army, and notice that the members of his army are stomping on Naram-Sin's enemies, and so Naram-Sin wanted to be remembered as a warrior. Next we have Gudea. Gudea is sitting on his throne. He has his hands clasped together in prayer, and he has the nice big eyes, pleading with the god or the goddess. Probably the god, since the main god of his city was a man. And so Gudea wanted to be remembered as an intercessor for his people. If you'll turn your sheet over, we have Ur-Nammu, and Ur-Nammu is shown standing, and it looks to me like he is standing before a god. Notice once again the ceremonial hat that the god is wearing there, and the ceremonial robe. And Ur-Nammu is shown standing before the god, and the god looks like he's giving him something. And so Ur-Nammu wanted to be remembered by his people as an intercessor. Ur-Nammu's son Shulgi is there, and notice that he wanted to be depicted exactly like his father was. He was wanting to be depicted as an intercessor. Now, even though the stelas that these came from show Ur-Nammu and Shulgi in the exact same position, These are actually different stelas depicting the different kings of city-states. And you can see from these carvings of the different men that they actually did look different. They weren't exactly the same. Again, Shulgi was Ur-Nammu's son. Both of them were strong kings of the third dynasty of Ur. And I'm going to stop just to highlight a little bit about the third dynasty of Ur, just because many biblical archaeologists think that Abraham was born during this third dynasty or at the very tail end of this third dynasty. So here's another stela of Ur-Nammu, and he is depicted at the top, and you'll notice that there's a very prominent depiction of the moon above Ur-Nammu in this stela. And that's because the main deity of the city of Ur was the god Nana, who was the god of the moon. The city of Ur was originally excavated from 1853 to 1854 on behalf of, you guessed it, the British Museum. And during this particular excavation, they did uncover the ziggurat of Ur. And here is an artist's sketch of what the ziggurat looked like when they first discovered it. Based on the excavations, archaeologists believe that this is how it may have originally looked. The name of this ziggurat was, I'm going to try and get it right, Et Amen Naguru, and it meant temple whose foundation creates aura. While Leonard Woolley was excavating the city of Ur, he continued the excavation of the ziggurat of Ur. And in the 1980s, when Saddam Hussein was in power in the country of Iraq, the ziggurat's remains were encased in a reconstruction of what it may have looked like during the time of Abraham. Now, in 1948, a very interesting tablet was found in the city of Nippur, which is north of the city of Ur. It was translated in 1952, and it turns out that it was a law code, and it was a law code that was credited to Ur-Nammu, and it dates to about 300 years older than the very famous code of Hammurabi, and historians now call it the Code of Ur-Nammu. This next week, when you read about the Code of Hammurabi, you'll learn that it was discovered in 1901, and so for some reason the Code of Hammurabi remains the more famous of the two codes. Part of the reason is probably because it was found earlier than the Code of Ur-Nammu, and part of the reason is because it was a little bit more complete than the Code of Ur-Nammu. Only about 57 of the laws were able to be recovered from the Code of Ur-Nammu. But it is an older law code than the Code of Hammurabi, interestingly enough. Here are some of the laws that were included in that law code. If a man commits murder, then he must be killed. If a man commits robbery, he will be killed. If a man commits a kidnapping, he is to be imprisoned and to pay 15 shekels of silver. Skimming down, if a man knocks out the eye of another man, he shall weigh out half a mina of silver. If a man has cut off another man's foot, he is to pay 10 shekels. If a man in the course of a scuffle smashes the limb of another man with a club, he shall pay 1 mina of silver. If a man appears as a witness but withdraws his oath, he must make payment to the extent of the value in the litigation of the case. If a man stealthily cultivates the field of another man, and he, that is, the other man, raises a complaint, he is, however, to be rejected, and this man will lose his expenses. If a man flooded the field of a man with water, he shall measure out 3 kur of barley per iku of the field. And so you can see, just based on the ones that we looked at here, and we haven't looked at all of them, that it was meant to bring justice and peace and a way to resolve conflicts between the people living under the rule of Ur-Nammu. I do want to mention that the law code was credited to Ur-Nammu. Some archaeologists think that it actually was instituted during the time of his son Shulgi. Alright, and to finish up our little worksheet, Here are some fragments of the victory stela of Eannatum, sometimes called the Stela of the Vultures because of the vultures that are depicted at the bottom of the stela. And so we see Eannatum depicted as riding in a chariot and overcoming many of his enemies. Thus the vultures coming down to pick the bones of the dead. And so pretty confidently we can say that Eannatum wanted to be remembered by his people as a warrior. In around 1808 BC, much of northern Mesopotamia was briefly united under the military of a man named Shamshi-Adad. Shamshi-Adad was the son of an Amorite king who ruled a small city-state near the trading city of Mari. His brother inherited the throne, leaving Shamshi-Adad to shift for himself. Shamshi-Adad was able to capture the city of Shekna, followed by the fortress of Ikalatum on the Tigris River. Control of these two cities gave him control of the city-state of Assur. He put his first son, Ishmi-Dagan, on the throne of Ikalatum, and he continued his expansion. After capturing the trading city of Mari, he set his second son, Yazma-Adad, on the throne. Shamshi-Adad's Assyrian empire did not last long after his death. Yazma-Adad was quickly ousted from Mari by Zimri-Lim, a descendant of the king of Mari who had ruled before Yazma-Adad took over. Using any source available to you, and I'm going to be your source today, locate and label Shamshi-Adad's kingdom on the map of ancient Mesopotamia below. Using a colored pencil or crayon, lightly shade this kingdom. So we'll go ahead and label it Shamshi-Adad's kingdom, and we will lightly shade it in. Turning the page over, because we're going to be reading about Hammurabi this next week. Hammurabi came to the throne of the Babylonian city-state in around 1792 BC. He was the sixth ruler of the first dynasty of Old Babylon. His territory was hemmed in by Shamshi-Adad's expanded Assur to the north, Rim-Sin of Larsa to the south, and the powerful Elamite kingdom to the east. After Shamshi-Adad's death, Hammurabi began to make alliances with the rulers of other nearby city-states to increase his own influence. With the help of Zimri-Lim of Mari, he first challenged the authority of the Elamites. After a year of fighting, the king of Elam surrendered. Hammurabi then turned his attention to Larsa. After a 6-month siege, Larsa also surrendered. Using any resource available to you, locate and label Hammurabi's kingdom on the map. With a colored pencil or crayon of a different color, lightly shade his kingdom. So we'll turn back to that map, and we will label Hammurabi's kingdom and shade it in. All right, so Middle Eastern kings of this time period maintained peaceful relations with each other in 3 different ways. First, through the exchange of letters and ambassadors or messengers. So when historians read through what still exists of these letters, the first thing that they notice is that the greetings and the salutations are very formulaic. That is, they tend to say the same thing in the same way. So here's an example of a greeting from a vassal king to his superior. It says, "Say to the king, my lord, this is the message of so-and-so your servant. The dirt at your feet, the mire that you tread on, fall at the feet of my lord 7 times and 7 times. And here is an example of what a king who feels like he is the equal of another king might send to him. Greetings or salutations from a king to his brother king. With me all is well. With you may all be well. With your household, your wives, your sons, your dignitaries, your horses, your chariots, your countries may all be well. With me all is well. With my household, my wives, my sons, my dignitaries, my horses, my many troops, all is well, and in my country all is very well." Number 2, they maintain peaceful relations through the exchange of gifts and other luxury items. For example, gold, textiles. Here we see someone weaving, exotic pets, silver, wood, ivory, and various kinds of jewelry. And number 3, through marriage alliances. Marrying your daughter to his son or your son to their daughter. That way, everyone has a relative in the court of their brother king and they're less likely to attack one another. Hammurabi was able to transform the city-state of Old Babylon into a regional power. In order to do this, he had to secure the loyalty of the conquered people within his larger territory. He did this in a number of ways. He took the ancient concept of the shepherd king to heart. He believed that he was the shepherd of his people, and he focused a lot of his attention on ensuring justice and peace in his kingdom. His concern for justice and peace was noted and remembered for hundreds of years after his death. Also, he tried to maintain a close relationship to all the Mesopotamian gods. He didn't favor the god of Babylon, who was Marduk, or the goddess of Uruk, Inanna, or the god of Nippur, Enlil, for example. He constructed many temples and publicly acknowledged his dependence on the favor of a number of Mesopotamian gods and goddesses. He also constructed a number of canals, and even named one of the canals after himself. Hammurabi exhibited 2 important characteristics of the ideal Mesopotamian king. Look back over your notes from class day and see if you can list those 2 characteristics. And you should know that they are being a triumphant warrior and being an intercessor to the gods. Today, Hammurabi is best known for his law codes. In 1901, French archaeologists were working at a site in Iran when they found a large black stone. The stone was about 8 feet high and 2 feet thick. It was covered in cuneiform, the wedge-shaped writing of ancient Mesopotamia. When the writing was deciphered, it turned out to be the oldest preserved code of laws. At the time, we've already discussed that in 1952 they discovered the law code of Ur-Nammu. While only one copy of Hammurabi's law code has been found, historians agree that it was not the only stela produced. Because of the size of the stela, it's believed to have been put on display, perhaps near a temple, so that the law code was an ongoing visible reminder of the justice the people could expect under Hammurabi. Hammurabi's laws were carefully engraved in 49 columns. The text is divided into 3 sections: the preamble, the laws, and an epilogue. Read the first and the last paragraphs of the preamble. Answer the questions that follow. If you have trouble remembering who the gods mentioned are, look back at the Mesopotamian gods and goddesses handout we filled in together. All right, so we're going to read the preamble together just to make sure that you understand it, and then I'd like you to fill in the answers to the questions at home. The preamble says, when Anu the Sublime, king of the Anuna gods, and Bel, the lord of heaven and earth, who decreed the fate of the land assigned to Marduk, the overruling son of Enki, god of righteousness, dominion over earthly man, and made him great among the lesser gods, the Igigi gods. They called Babylon by its illustrious name. They made it great on earth, and they founded an everlasting kingdom in it, whose foundations are laid so solidly as those of heaven and earth. Then Anu and Bel called by name me, Hammurabi, the exalted prince, who feared God, to bring about the rule of righteousness in the land, to destroy the wicked and the evildoers, so that the strong should not harm the weak, so that I should rule over the black-headed people, like Shamash, god of the sun and justice, and to enlighten the land to further the well-being of mankind. When Marduk sent me to rule over men, to give the protection of right to the land, I did right and righteousness in, and I brought about the well-being of the oppressed. So we see here that he's crediting the creation of his kingdom, not just the creation of the world, but the creation of his kingdom, the kingdom of Babylon, to several of the Mesopotamian gods: Anu, Bel, Marduk. He points out that these gods called the kingdom of Babylon by name, and they chose him specifically to be the ruler of this kingdom that they established very firmly, and that he obeyed their command to become the ruler of Babylon, and that he did right and righteous in their eyes by establishing a law code, a righteous law code for the people of Babylon. He calls them the black-headed people. Remember that a preamble is an introduction, and it states the purpose of what's about to follow. So the first question asks, what does this preamble state as the purpose of the code to follow? And there are several purposes mentioned there: to enlighten the land, to further the well-being of mankind, to bring about the well-being of the oppressed. And so those are the kinds of answers that you should give, and I'll leave you to fill in the rest of that. At the bottom of the page it says, below are the first 5 laws from Hammurabi's code. Read through these laws and briefly restate in your own words what each is trying to say. And so you're going to do just exactly what it asks you to do. You're going to read the code, and then you're going to, in modern English, just summarize what it has to say. For example, if anyone hauls a man before the judge and makes an accusation against him, but he cannot prove it, then he that accused shall be put to death. And so we see here that this is a law against bringing false accusations about people, and they thought that it was so serious and wanted to deter it so much that if you did that, that the penalty for that would be your own death. And so it was a law against false accusation, and it gave a very high, terrible punishment for doing that. I also wanted to point out that after you do your reading assignment in Chapter 5 and learn more about Hammurabi, I want you to look a little bit further into some of the laws that he enacted. One of the most interesting parts of Hammurabi's law code relates to the social status of the people the laws applied to. The punishment for a crime usually varied according to the offender's social status, and certain social classes were specifically defined in the laws. For example, there were the Amelu. They were the free-born citizens of the upper class. This generally included government officials, priests, and military officers and their families. The Mushkenu were the common people, or the middle class. This usually consisted of tradespeople and professionals like doctors and lawyers and scribes, and other workers like blacksmiths and home builders and things like that. Then, of course, there were the slaves. The slaves were the wardu. They were the members of the lowest class in society. The slave class was created both from prisoners of war and Babylonian citizens who had been forced into slavery, either as a punishment for a crime or for economic reasons. Actually, one of the laws that I'm not having you read says that if a man can't pay his bills and he sells himself into slavery, that he only has to stay in slavery for 3 or 4 years, and then he's given his freedom again. Although slaves were under the complete domination of their master, they could own property, and they could conduct business in their own name, as well as eventually purchase their freedom if they were able to. Some of Hammurabi's laws favored people with a higher social status, but keep in mind that the laws were an attempt to provide justice for every class of people. Read the laws below and label each law with the name of the social class that it most likely applies to: Amalu, Mushkenu, or Wardu. And so that first one says, if a man strikes a freeborn woman so that she loses an unborn child, he shall pay 10 shekels for her loss. And so because it says that it's a freeborn woman, we know that this law was meant to protect women who were in the highest social class, the Amalu. And so as you read through, just make your best guess as to who it is. Look for things like maidservant for the slave class, or look for words about a profession, whether it is a lawyer or a blacksmith or things like that. Look, if they're in a profession, you know that it's meant to protect someone in the Mushkenu class. And finally, if it says specifically freeborn, then you know that it has to do with the Amalu. Now, some of the laws might have to do with more than one class, so you may be able to write down 2 social classes. As part of your source document assignments this next week, one of the things I want you to do is just to analyze the stela where the Code of Hammurabi was found just on its own. And so most of these questions I'm going to let you go ahead and fill in yourself, but before you do that, I did want to point out a couple of features on the stone. So the stone itself is cylinder shaped. It has cuneiform on it, but it also has human figures on it. One of the figures is seated and the other one is standing. And so let's go ahead and we'll look at a closer version of the 2 figures. Notice that the figure that is seated has water coming out of its shoulders, and it's wearing that twisted cone-shaped ceremonial hat that I mentioned earlier in this video, was associated with the gods. And so I think it's probably pretty secure inference that the person sitting down is one of the gods. If you look back at your handout where we discussed the different Mesopotamian gods, you can probably figure out which one it is. It's also a pretty safe inference that the person standing before the god and being given something is a depiction of Hammurabi himself. The second part of your source document assignments this week has you analyzing parts of the Code of Hammurabi. And so I would like to do 2 samples with you together in class today. This will give you an idea of the kinds of questions you'll be expected to answer at home. Keeping in mind that these are just samples, they aren't on your worksheet. These are just the kinds of things you'll be asked to do on your worksheet when you get to your source document assignment this week. So we'll go ahead and do a sample of the kinds of things you'll find in part 1. It says, below are some of the laws of Hammurabi's code. Reach each group of laws and then answer the questions. So you've got a group of laws here. First law says, if a man adopt a child and to his name as a son and rear him, his grown son cannot be demanded back again by his biological family. Second law says, if an artisan has undertaken to rear a child and teaches him his craft, he cannot be demanded back, once again, by his biological family. However, says the next one, if he has not taught him his craft, this adopted son may return to his father's house. And the final law in that group, if a man does not maintain a child that he has adopted as a son and reared with his other children, then his adopted son may return to his father's house. And so the first question is, do we have similar laws today? Do we have laws that regulate adoption today? The answer is yes, we do have laws about adoption today. However, they're not as specific as this. They're not as specific as to, did you maintain your obligations and can the person return to their father's house? However, there are protections for adopted families about biological families coming back and trying to take a child away from the adopted family. So this is sort of a yes and a no. Yes, we do have laws that deal with adoption today, but they're not as specific as the laws that you see here. Then it asks, what aspect of life does this law affect? Is it affecting their business? Is it affecting their rights as citizens? In this case, it specifically is affecting people's home lives or their family life. So who is this law designed to benefit? And since it has to do with the family, it is designed to both protect adopted children, but it's also meant to protect the father in the case of having adopted children. Why do you think this law was needed? That's the interesting thing, that sometimes we read old laws and we think, what a ridiculous law. That is so dumb. For example, in Kentucky, there's a law that up until about 10 years ago was still on the books, where you're not allowed to put an ice cream cone in your back pocket. And I always try to teach my students that anytime you read even a stupid law, the reason they put laws into effect is because there was a problem, and so they needed to address that problem. In the case of the ice cream cone in the back pocket, back in the early 1900s, they had a problem with people stealing horses. And so if a horse was found on your property that didn't belong to you, one of the excuses you could make was, well, the horse followed me home. I didn't steal it. It just followed me home. And so the original owner can have it back, but don't arrest me for stealing a horse. And so what they were doing was that they would stick an ice cream cone in their back pocket, and the horse who liked sweet things would just follow them anywhere they went. And so the Kentucky General Assembly had to pass a law saying, well, you can't stick ice cream cones in your back pocket anymore if you're going to use that as an excuse as to why we can't arrest you for stealing someone's horse. And so in this case, why do you think this law was needed? This law was probably needed because either people who had adopted children were having the biological family come back and want them back, or in the case of needing to give them a trade or taking care of them,
obviously some children were being adopted and then not being treated like the other children, not being treated well. And so Hammurabi was trying to address that. And then the last question, what kinds of things might happen if the law didn't exist? In this case, some of it's obvious. Children who are adopted might be mistreated. Children who are adopted might not learn the trade that their adopted father did, and so they might grow up and have no trade to step into, and no training, and so it was meant to protect them. Moving on, part 2. These are the kinds of questions that you'll see in part 2, comparing the Code of Hammurabi to the Law Code of Moses. And one reason why I gave you this assignment is because a lot of people do compare the Code of Hammurabi to the Law Code given to the people of Israel by Moses 400 years later. I do have a note about that I hope you'll read in your homework this week. So, Hammurabi's Law Code says, if while an ox is passing on the street, someone push it and kill it, the owner can set up no claim in the suit against the hirer. In other words, if you hire out your oxen and someone is bringing that oxen through the street and somebody else comes along and pushes it and kills it, you have to go to be compensated from the person who pushed it, not the person who paid you to hire out your oxen. Next one says, if an ox be a goring ox, and it's shown that he is a gorer, and the person who owns it doesn't bind its horns or fasten the ox up, and the ox gores a freeborn man and kills him, the owner shall pay 1/2 mina in money. So if you are aware that your ox is dangerous, then you are held liable if it gores somebody and kills them. And we do find a similar law in the book of Exodus. Exodus 21 says, if a bull gores a man or a woman to death, the bull must be stoned to death, and its meal must not be eaten. But the owner of the bull will not be held responsible. If, however, a bull has the habit of goring, and the owner has been warned but has not kept it penned up, and it kills a man or a woman, the bull must be stoned, and then the owner must also be put to death. However, if payment is demanded of him, he may redeem his life by paying whatever's determined. This law also applies if the bull gores a son or a daughter. If the bull gores a male or a female slave, the owner must pay 30 shekels of silver to the master of the slave, and the bull must be stoned. If a man uncovers a pit or digs one, and fails to cover it, and an ox or a donkey falls into it, the owner of the pit must pay for the loss. He must pay its owner, and the dead animal will be his. If a man's bull injures the bull of another and it dies, they are to sell the live one and divide both the money and the dead animal equally. However, if it was known that the bull had the habit of goring, yet the owner did not keep it penned up, the owner must pay animal for animal, and the dead animal will be his. So, it says, look up and summarize the law of Moses. So, pet owners are responsible for what their pets do. You must not harm others or their animals. All right, the next little section says, questions to consider. Was this law appropriate for the time period? And so, yes, it was appropriate for the time period when they were using a lot of oxen. Was it fair or was it unfair? And this is an opinion question. It's for you to decide. I'm the one giving my opinion right now, and so it seems to me that it is indeed a fair law. And then finally it asks, have society's problems changed or have they remained the same? Again, this is your opinion. In my opinion, society's problems have changed. People don't worry about other people's oxen goring them. However, thinking of animals, they do worry about other people's dogs specifically hurting them. We have a lot of laws today about what kinds of dogs you're allowed to keep, whether when they're out, whether you need to have them on a leash or no leash, and what you do with their waste. A lot of cities, for example, make you pick up all dog waste that is left behind. And so society has changed. In other words, we're worried about other kinds of animals that people own. We're no longer really worried about their oxen goring people. We're going to stop there for today. As always, I hope that you enjoy your lesson this week, and if you have any questions, please let me know.